Hello learners, I am Dr. V. Venkatramanan from School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Today we will be discussing on the topic the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. We know fully well that the climate change is affecting the human beings in all possible ways, and in order to contain, in order to checkmate the climate change, a lot of measures have been taken at the national level, at the global level also. One such initiative is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. To start with, what exactly happened, what all the negotiations that led to Paris Agreement? Let us go back to 1980s. So in 1988, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established with the basic objective of knowing exactly what is happening in the science of climate change. The second important objective why IPCC was established is to know the causes of climate change. So with these two objectives in mind, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established in the year 1988. Soon after, in 1992, a very important summit, that is called Earth Summit, took place in Rio de Janeiro, and in that Earth Summit, along with many other conventions, one important convention took shape, that is called United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was adopted in 1992, nevertheless it has came into force in 1994. The basic objective of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That is a basic objective of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change acknowledges a very important principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. As we all know that the developed countries are responsible for most of the greenhouse gases emissions in the atmosphere. So they are responsible for causing a lot of pollution in the atmosphere. So they need to take all the steps possible to contain climate change, both by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and also by providing the technical, financial support to the developing countries. Soon after the implementation of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, at Conference of Parties 3 in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, which came into force only in the year 2005. The Kyoto Protocol is a very interesting one because that was the first step to contain climate change. The Kyoto Protocol commits the developed countries to quantified reduction of their collective carbon emissions to the tune of 5.2% by 2012 as compared to the 1990 level. This Kyoto Protocol established an international emission trading system and also the clean development mechanism, allowing the developed countries to meet their commitment with emission reduction projects in the developing countries. So the key aspect of Kyoto Protocol is the flexible mechanisms. One is the emission trading, the second one is the clean development mechanism, the third one is the joint implementation. These are the key important features of Kyoto Protocol. Very importantly, in case of Kyoto Protocol, the United States of America did not ratify this protocol. Thereafter, since the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, a very interesting development took place in 2009 at Copenhagen that resulted in Copenhagen Accord. Basically, this Copenhagen Agreement is a non-binding document. This Copenhagen Accord set a target of limiting the global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade. And also the second important aspect of this Copenhagen Accord is to establish the Green Climate Fund. These are the two important outcome of this Copenhagen discussions, or in other words, a lot of things, negotiations that happen in the Copenhagen. These are the two important things. This is a very important step towards the Paris Agreement. Later on, since later after the Copenhagen Accord, in the year 2011, Durban conference at COP17 took place, and that is a very important thing, and in fact that led to the Paris Agreement. And in the year 2014, the Lima Call for Climate Action, which was outcome of the Lima conference, that is a very important thing as far as the climate change negotiation is concerned, because in this call for climate action, it invited all the parties to communicate their plans, their pledges for post 2020 climate action in the form of intended nationally determined contribution. That's a very important development. So, Copenhagen Accord, Durban Conference, Lima Call, all zeroed down to a very important agreement called Paris Agreement. So, in the year 2015 COP21, Paris Agreement was adopted, and very next year in the year 2016 4th November, the Paris Agreement came into force. When you look at the Paris Agreement, the objectives are very important thing, because the basic objective of Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade WB2C above the pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So, the objective states categorically that we should take all the steps possible, proactive, practical, pragmatic steps possible, so that the temperature increases well below 2 degrees centigrade. But however, we will be also taking all the steps possible to keep it well below 1.5 degrees centigrade also. So, this is the first objective of Paris Agreement. The second objective of Paris Agreement is increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and lower the greenhouse gas emission development in a manner that does not threaten the food production. It is a very important objective. Why? Because along with the mitigation, the adaptation strategies also should be focused. The second important aspect of this objective is because the agriculture as a component, as a sector, is also responsible for causing climate change, because it also emits a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So, all the measures, the mitigation measures in the agriculture sector should be taken in such a way that the food production should not be affected, should be stabilized indeed. So, the measures should be more of the mitigation and adaptation, a kind of a synergy has to be taken into account between the mitigation and adaptation strategies. That is the second objective of Paris Agreement. The third objective of Paris Agreement is regarding the climate finance part. So, in this objective, what it says that the finance should be provided to the developing countries or low developing countries, so that they will be taking all the measures, steps possible to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from their country, from all economic scale. Economy means whether it is agriculture, industrial sector, every possible ways they will be trying to take the steps by adopting new technologies, very sustainable technologies, so that the greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced. So, in a way, they will be moving towards a climate resilient development. The pathway, the economic development will be climate resilient in nature. So, this is the third important objective of Paris Agreement. Now, when you look at very carefully this agreement will be implemented to reflect the equity. Equity principle is a very important thing, and also the important principle, as I stated earlier, it is the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Okay, in light of the different nation circumstances, because when you look at the low developing countries or small island developing countries, their circumstances, it's different, totally different, because from the perspective of the economy, from the perspective of the development, so it is totally different. So, each and every country will have its own path to achieve the targets as far as the climate change targets are concerned. So, the principles, the underlying principle of this agreement, when you look at it, is the equity principle. All should be taken into account on the same path to contain climate change. The second important thing is the common but differentiated responsibility, because the climate change is a common problem. At the same time, the responsibility should be differentiated. So, that is the key principle as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned. And when you look at still further, very importantly, what has happened in the Paris Agreement is that there is the nationally determined contributions to the global response to climate change is a very important component of Paris Agreement. in fact all the parties, irrespective of the country, irrespective of their the developmental trajectory, all the parties should undertake and communicate their ambitious efforts, that is the contributions, the pledges, with a view to achieving the purpose of this Paris Agreement. So in a way they have to substantially provide the intended nationally determined contributions. So that is a very important aspect of the Paris Agreement, because every country will take their own measures, steps possible. So when they have their pledges, when they have their goal in front of them, definitely they will be taking a lot of proactive steps. And definitely in that context also, their circumstances, their requirements, their reservations will be taken into account. So how it will be taken into account? Through a lot of financial support from the developed countries, the technological support from the developed countries. So the next important aspect of the Paris Agreement is that whatever the efforts, the nationally determined contributions, the efforts, that will represent a progression over time. The progression, it should be always forthcoming, or it should be futuristic in nature. So this progression over time, the efforts definitely has to be there, while recognizing the need to support the developing country, the parties, for the effective implementation of this target. It's a very, very important point actually, because whatever the pledges are there, it has to be forthcoming in nature. So then only we can achieve the targets of Paris Agreement, because keeping well below 2 degrees centigrade is a Herculean task. So for that, lot of measures has to be taken, and the measures should be both mitigation and also adaptation strategies has to be taken into account. So in order to achieve this long term, the temperature goal, I said WB2C, that is well below 2 degrees centigrade, the parties aim to reach the global peaking, global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. That's a very important aspect, and of course it has to be recognized that the peaking will take longer for developing country parties, because it will take longer time. At the same time, for the developed country it might take much earlier also. So what is important is that we need to take the steps possible for reaching the global peaking as possible in a much earlier stage, so that we can take the steps possible to contain the effects, the negative impacts of climate change. So this is also very much part of the Paris Agreement. And when you look at the demand, the focus of the Paris Agreement on the country's scale, if you look at it, the developed country, the parties, the countries should continue taking the lead, like in a leadership role, by undertaking economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets, economy-wide, whether it is an agriculture, industrial sector, everything has to be taken into account. So in a way, economic-wide emission reduction targets has to be placed for the developed countries. So then only it will be easier. As far as the developing countries are concerned, they also should continue to take all the steps possible. Their mitigation efforts and everything should be taken into account, and slowly and steadily taking into account their reservations, taking into account their national circumstances, taking into account their socio-economic developmental trajectory also. And as far as the least developed countries are concerned, and also the small island developing countries are concerned, they may prepare and communicate the strategies, the mitigation strategies, adaptation strategies, the plans and actions, so that it should reflect the circumstances, national circumstances, and also they should be in a pragmatic way, because their contributions is also equally important for achieving the targets of Paris Agreement. As I told earlier, each and every party, it is a binding duty of each and every party to communicate a nationally determined contribution every 5 years. They should provide these kind of pledges, the intended nationally determined contribution for every 5 years. And the parties should take action to as much as possible to mitigate the climate change by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and also very importantly, they can take the measures to conserve the sinks, the what you call the forest activities, because agricultural activity, they all acts as a sink, that's a very important thing that has to be taken into account. So whether it's a developed country or a developing country, along with the adaptation strategies, they should also take into account the sequestration potentials in the sectors like forestry sector, agriculture sector. So this is a very, very important thing, because these sectors, the agriculture or forestry sector, can have a very important role to play as far as the mitigation is concerned, because they can act as a sink or a reservoir of greenhouse gases. So there are a lot of measures, a lot of policies has to be taken into account to conserve these resources. Whether it's a forestry sector or a biodiversity regions, it has to be conserved, because they are the real sink for greenhouse gases. They can sequester the carbon dioxide, they can sequester the greenhouse gases. So the policies, if you look at it, the policies and the incentives the countries should focus on is like the red. It's a very important thing, reducing the emissions from deforestation and degradation. That's one important aspect. The second important aspect, as I told earlier also, will all the steps possible, whether it's a conservation and in sustainable management, indeed, because the management of the forest and everything should be sustainable in nature, so in such a way that they can sequester more and more of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that is a very important aspect, because along with the mitigation, the adaptation is a very, very key thing as far as the developing countries and low developing countries are concerned. Now, as far as the parties are concerned, they need to establish the global goal on adaptation, global goal of adaptation, because when I talk about the global goal of adaptation, I am trying to stress an important point on enhancing or augmenting the adaptive capacity of adaptive capacity is a very, very important thing as far as the developmental trajectory is concerned. It's a very, very important thing. So along with that thing, when you talk about adaptive capacity, the closely related one is the resilience. So we need to strengthen the resilience. That's very much part of the Paris Agreement. And when you talk about the adaptive capacity and strengthening the resilience, automatically what is coming to your mind is to reduce the vulnerability to climate change. So these are the three important things that has to be taken into account, because when you take these three important things, adaptive capacity and the climate resilience and reducing the vulnerability, what happens? We are trying to achieve the sustainable development. We are in a position to achieve the goals of Paris Agreement, and we can maintain, and at the same time we can maintain the economic development in a most sustainable manner. So we must take all the steps possible to increase the adaptive capacity. That's the most important thing. And this Paris Agreement, a very important article that has mentioned about that, in fact it recognizes the importance of minimizing and addressing the loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, whether it's an extreme weather events or the slow onset events. These all have been very much factored in the Paris Agreement, because it's a very important thing, because the loss and damage clause is very important part of the Paris Agreement. So, as I told earlier, the developing countries should get all the financial, technological support from the developed countries, because they are responsible for causing a lot of harm to the environment. So, the developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist the developing countries with respect to both mitigation but also adaptation. So, that is the most important aspect of the Paris Agreement. And as far as the parties are concerned, they must also share a long-term vision. I said it's a global problem. Global climate change is a global problem. And when I say it's a global problem, the focus on the technology, the focus on the finance part and the transfer of the technology are also equally important. So then only the climate resilient development can be achieved. So this is also factored in this Paris Agreement. So to sum it up, as far as the Paris Agreement on climate change is concerned, the most striking feature of Paris Agreement is universality. It is applicable universally. It applies to all parties of Paris Agreement. So that is the most striking feature of Paris Agreement. The second important aspect of Paris Agreement is it is based on equity principle. It is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It's a very, very important principle that is very much part of the Paris Agreement. This is the second principle. And the third important thing is the Paris Agreement is a legal instrument. It's a legal instrument that will guide the process for universally acting on climate change. It's a legally binding document. Or in other words, you can say it's a hybrid of legally binding and non-binding provisions. Okay, it's having both legally binding and legally binding provisions also. So in a way, what I want to say is that the Paris Agreement consists of a core agreement. It's the core agreement which will be binding on all parties, while there are certain elements of the Paris Agreement which are not part of the legally binding agreement. So in a way, it is kind of an hybrid, it's kind of an hybrid. So it is having both legally binding and non-legally binding provisions also. As far as architecture is concerned, the Paris Agreement exhibit hybrid architecture in which a bottom-up approach to promote participation is combined with the top-to-down process to promote ambition and also accountability. It's a very important thing, because the participation from the bottom level to top, that is the most important thing, because community participation can play definitely a wonderful part as far as the adaptation is concerned. It's a very important thing. So that is why I said that both bottom to top and top to down approach has been very much part of the Paris Agreement. And very importantly, repeatedly I am talking about the INDC, because all parties must undertake and communicate the intended nationally determined contributions to the global response to climate change. So it's a very important part of the Paris Agreement. So, and very importantly, the efforts of all parties, irrespective of their the developmental trajectories, they must represent a progression over time. So this is the striking feature of Paris Agreement. Thank you.